Introduction. My name is Michael Womack. I am the executive director here at South Texas Botanical Gardens and Nature Center. I've been in this position for about 16 years now, 17 years. Anyway, I love teaching master gardeners. I have taught master gardeners for over 25 years. I was the county agent here for horticulture in Nueces County from 1997 to about 2006. And then I moved to the botanical gardens full time. But I love teaching this. I'm going to be teaching you practical botany. I call it practical botany instead of basic botany because, you know, there's a lot of things in the scientific side. You can get, I think for horticulture, for gardeners, we need to see the practical side of things, but it's important to understand some of these basic principles. This is an overview that you're getting of botany. I'm going to give you basically a semester's worth of botany in two-hour sessions. So in 4 hours, you're going to get basically information from a college level botany class crammed into a short period. I'm going to hit the highlights. I think that you will see that along the way. Look at what I'm doing. Go back into your Master Gardener books. This is all in that opening chapter of your Master Gardener book. I took this out of there from the old book. I'm sure it's still the same basic information. No one told me last year to change it afterwards. So, but I want to give you these things that will help you as a gardener. Some of y'all have been had botany classes in the past, and for you, it's like, you know, let's brush that off. Some of you may not have really had biology classes in the past, or it's been so long. Again, I want you to look at the big picture of things, some things that will help you as master gardeners. Part of this will help you understand the parts of plants, the structures of plants. I would need you to be familiar with some of the terminology because you're going to be hearing this in other lectures as you go through your Master Gardener class. You're going to be talking about plant processes like photosynthesis or transpiration or dormancy. And I need you to have a little bit of a background so you just go, I have no clue what they're talking about. But you have a little bit of a background, and then hopefully you'll be doing a little more exploration, going back through your book, doing some more reading online as you find a topic that really interests you or that you're hearing a lot about. So that's why I'm doing this as a practical botany class. And one of the first things that you're going to have to deal with is identifying plants. People will bring you a plant. They'll bring you a leaf. They'll bring you a flower as a master gardener. Say, what is this? And sometimes you need more, but you need to have a little bit of an understanding of how we classify things. And there's multiple types of classification systems we're going to cover. The basic classification we're going to look at. Let me go back to, let's see, here we go. So it'll actually come up. What we're going to be looking at under classification is nomenclature is the formal scientific word for classification, naming. It literally means naming in Latin. And so we use a system of binomial nomenclature. Binomial means to name, naming system. And with that, what we use is, in science, we use what we call the genus and species. The species is more specific, and then the genus is kind of like the surname. So we often call this the scientific name. We call it the botanical name in classes. Same thing, but it's dealing with what's the genus and species. And you think about it as like a last name first for people. The genus would be like, my last name is Womack, the species is Michael. So there's multiple Womacks in my family. There's only one Michael. So that's kind of think of it that way. It's always either underlined or it's in italics so that you know that it is the scientific name of it. And so the genus is always capitalized. The species is always lowercase. So some little things about nomenclature. How did we come up with this? This was developed originally by Carl Linnaeus back in the 1700s, and he was looking for ways to have a uniform system of identifying things. we've had common names for years, but it causes problems because there's a lot of them out there. So he went and looked at things, basing them on plant parts. And so he looked at common plant parts and grouped those plants together that had commonalities. And the same thing's true then with animals as well. So here we have this thing of common names versus scientific names that you often come across. And they're both important, and we use both of them for various things at various times. But what I want you to be familiar with then is which one's more important. Is it better to use a common name or a scientific name? And what do we use the most? Typically, we use common names the most. It's what we're familiar with. It's easy to remember. But what's really better is the scientific name. And you might ask why. Well, scientific names are known throughout the world. It's a uniform system. And it helps you to pull plants together in other classifications. This is the bottom end of our classification system, the genus and species, but it helps you to group plants into larger groups above them. So there is theoretically now only one scientific name per plant, but that's one of the reasons we use it. Now, what we have done is, as we've become smarter, we have more information available to us. We have found that some of our classifications weren't correct. As we start looking closer into the cell structures, into the plant systems of some of these plants. So we have changed a few names through the years, or we found a better way to describe them. And so you may see a few changes, but still typically there's one scientific name per plant, or one accepted scientific name. The problem with common names is they're based on the region. What may be called, for instance, buttercups in South Texas, what we think of as buttercups is going to be different than buttercups you find up in the Midwest, in Chicago and places like that. Down here, people use things like the pink evening primrose. Some people will call that a buttercup, even because the center of it is yellow. That's not the same buttercup as what there's, because that's what we see a lot of. That's not the same thing as what you're seeing in other areas. So that's why common names have their problems. For instance, the plant that's on the right side of your picture right now, that plant goes by several scientific or common names, but you may be familiar with it. It is a tropical small tree, large bush in our area, from Mexico. Again, that you'll see that leaf. It's a compound leaf with broad leaflets on it, 5 of them, and then it has this big green base to it that stores water. And so some of the common names you may see this as, and then when it flowers, it either has a pink or a white flower before it leaves out in the winter, or in the spring. You'll see these white kind of fuzzy flowers up above. And so the common names for that is a Mexican shaving brush. But the scientific name is Pseudobombax ellipticum. There's only one plant that's known as Pseudobombax ellipticum. So you can go anywhere and talk about Pseudobombax ellipticum and know what plant you're talking about. Locally, some places they'll call it the bombax tree, or what we call it locally is Mexican shaving brush, because the flower of it looks like that old-fashioned men's shaving brush, and it's from Mexico. That's the name Mexican shaving brush. So that's the common name. But that may not be the only name that you may see of it. You may just hear it called the shaving brush tree. It's like not realizing it's from Mexico at that point. But I'm going to induct you into a special group that's going to learn one other scientific or one other common name for this plant. And for y'all, you're going to be this elite group that may know it as the frog butt plant from here on out. And this common name is specific to Corpus Christi and Rockport and a few people right around here, because I'm sharing this common name that was developed by my wife. When we first were married, I had a Pseudobombax ellipticum, or Mexican shaving brush tree, in a pot. And it had the bright green enlarged bases, and it had two large branches coming up from the base. So you had a big fat round base and two large skinny trunks coming up from there with these the top. And to her, the frog butt plant, my wife called it that because when she saw it, it reminded her of a frog digging itself into the mud and its legs were sticking up because it had a big green base to it. So that's how a common name comes about. Someone sees it, it reminds them of. And so, but if you go anywhere else in the world and you say, I want to see this frog butt plant, they're not going to have a clue what you're talking about because it was a common name. But you can go anywhere and say, I want to see a Pseudobombax ellipticum, and you'll make sure that you're looking at that same plant. So that's the reason why scientific names may be very different depending on where you are, or it could be just the name in that very local space. Now you can take that and use that common name and Google it and find out what the plant is with pictures. That's a great thing with the age that we're in now. We used to not have that available. Another example of common names that may vary is this plant with the purple flowers over here. It is a Texas native, and that is most commonly known around here as Texas sage. But there are a lot of other common names, depending on where you're at, it could also go by. It could go by, some people just call it purple sage. They remember it was a sage, it has purple flowers, thus purple sage. Some people will call it Texas silverleaf. The leaf on itself is very silver looking, and that is a way that it reflects light. So, but that's what it looks like. So people may not think of it as sage, they may think of it as Texas silverleaf. Or some people call it the barometer plant, and that's because it blooms either right before or right after it rains. And so it is a survival mechanism so that it will have flowers when there's pollinators around and be able to quickly complete its life cycle and let those seeds drop and start new plants. So it may be called the barometer plant by some people. Cenizo is another name from the Spanish derivative. But if you want to find it anywhere you go, it's going to be Leucophyllum frutescens. It's also called, another common name I just remembered was sometimes it's called Texas Ranger in some places. So again, but if you're really wanting to find it, it's Leucophyllum frutescens. But you don't always remember that. Scientific names are easier. The more you use them, you get more familiar with them. So that's one that you may want to commit to memory before it's over with. Take a couple, learn a couple, get familiar with them, use them a lot, and say that's Leucophyllum, so that you're familiar with that. And then learn 3 or 4 more, and then learn 3 or 4 more after that. And that's the way you learn scientific names. Another one is this plant. It's a tropical small tree in our area. You may know this. The common name of this, you're probably seeing this. The scientific name is Charicia speciosa, but in other areas of the world, you may see it as either the silk floss tree, because the interior of the fruit has this silk flossiness to it, or it's also locally known as the kapok tree. But there's other plants that are known as kapok trees in other areas. In our region, you recognize it by the green bark and the big green thorns that stand out from it. When it does bloom, it has these beautiful lily-like flowers up in the surface. Then it does produce a fruit, and that fruit expands, and it has, again, this kind of silkiness on the inside when it opens. And they used to take the interior of that fruit and use that for flotation devices. And so that was used back in the late 1800s, early 1900s for flotation devices or life vests. Another example is this wildflower that we see down here. The scientific name of it is going to be Gaillardia grandiflora. If you don't remember that, some of the common names it goes by locally would be Gaillardia. Some people just call it Gaillardia. Most commonly, it's known either as an Indian blanket or a fire wheel. So again, common names, you got to be familiar with it. But this is another one you probably want to remember, take to heart, is Gaillardia grandiflora. Again, pick 4 or 5 of them, get familiar with the picture and the name next to it. Maybe, you can do it with flashcard type things, and The more you use them, the more they'll be there on the top of your mind. Another element that may sometimes come is when you have different things that use the same common name. For instance, sage. We talked about this purple sage earlier, Texas sage or purple sage. That is Leucophyllum frutescens. We talked about that, and it's in the family of Scrophulariaceae. So try to say that 3 times fast. It's not a lot of fun, but you can learn it. Trust me, it took me a while. But this is what we know as Texas sage. However, there's other types of sage, including other Texas native sages. This is the one that just popped up here. This is Salvia leucantha, or Mexican bush sage. So if you're talking about sages, it is also known as a sage, and it is purple. So some people probably have even called that a purple sage at some point. But that's what we know commonly as Mexican bush sage in our region, but it's in a completely different family. It's in the Lamiaceae family, or the mint family. It used to be called the Labiatae family, but now it's the Lamiaceae family. So even though it has that common name of sage, they're in 2 completely different plant families, which means they're not closely related. And then you have common garden sage, which you probably have had in your yard or in a pot that you cook with. And that is common garden sage, is Salvia officinalis, also in the Lamiaceae family. So when you look at this, you'll see that they're both in the same family. The Mexican bush sage and the common garden sage are both in the Lamiaceae family, and they're actually both salvias. So they're in the same genus, but they're different species. One being Salvia leucantha, the other Salvia officinalis. So you can kind of see that grouping of how those fit, and the importance of having the naming, understanding that naming. So let's go into the plant classification systems. There's a whole round of how it gets more specific as you get into a plant classification system. And when I went through college, the classification system, we all remember the kingdoms. We talk about the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, and now you have the fungi and the algae and all kinds of other kingdoms. But typically, let's keep this simple. And with plants, we talk about kingdoms, we talk about a phylum, a class, an order, a family, a genus, and a species. As you go down this, kingdom is the biggest, broadest component, and that is split into phyla. And so within that, a single is a phylum, multiples would be phyla. So that kingdom is split. Then each of the phyla are being split into classes, and then classes get split into orders, and then orders get split into families, and families get split into genera, which is the plural of genus. And then each genera or each genus is going to be split into different species. And even within species, you can have either subspecies or you can have cultivars, cultivated varieties within it. So, when I was in college, I was trying to figure out which one, how does this all connect? I wasn't sure how to do that. And so we were given a couple of memory helpers, and the ones that helped me the most to remember how far up it is on the scale is kind professors cannot often fail good students. Being a good student, that made me feel good, but kind professors cannot often fail good students. And most of the time when we're dealing with stuff in plants, we're dealing with the family, the genus, and the species. But I'll tell you, when you get into insects and some of those things, you're going to have some specialists come in and talk about classes and orders and families. And I always got classes and orders mixed up. And it's like, is it a class? Is the class more narrow, more specific, or is the order? And I could always got that mixed up in my mind. So I could go, okay, kind professors cannot often. Okay, class is bigger. Class is a bigger grouping. It has more things in it than order. Kind professors cannot often fail good students. That's how I remembered it. Find the one that works for you. When I started as Master Gardener coordinator here, they had a different one that the previous agent used that I had never heard of, but maybe it'll help you, especially if you're uh, possibly a history person, and their thought was King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So if you're a foodie or a history person, maybe that's an easier one for you to remember. For me, I remembered kind professors cannot often fail good students. But again, as you go further up, the broader the area is, the more things that are within it. And then each one of those is split as you go down. So that's the basic classification system in the binomial nomenclature system. So, and you're going to see a few of these even as we go through. Some other things that you may hear about from a gardening standpoint or a horticulture standpoint is starting with a subkingdom of angiosperms versus gymnosperms. Angiosperms are what we call the true flowering plants. And we have monocots and we have dicots, and those are classes. Remember, kind professors cannot, way up there, monocots and dicots are way up in the scale. So you have Liliopsida and Magnoliopsida as the two classes for monocots and dicots. Mono meaning one, cot is short for cotyledon or seed leaf, di meaning two for cotyledon, two seed leaves. We'll be talking about those a little bit more in a few minutes, but you'll hear those terms a lot. But when we're talking monocots and dicots, we're talking about classes, so it's way up on that classification scale. So we also talk about, besides the angiosperms being the true flowering plants, the subkingdom of angiospermae, then we go into gymnosperms, which is the naked seed plants, not true flowering plants, or sometimes called the cone-bearing plants. And so that division or phylum is, there's 4 different divisions within that subkingdom. You have 4 divisions. If it was an animal, it'd be a division. For plants, we typically call them phylums. So you have Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, Coniferophyta, and Cnidophyta. And so these are your conifers, like your pine trees. You have cycads, you have ginkgo trees, and then the nettles are a small little group of plants that don't really affect us around here, but they're known as the plants with naked seeds. So again, just need you to think about this in a broad sense of things, that if something's an angiosperm or a true flowering plant, monocot and dicot, they're close together. But your conifers and your cycads, even though they may look like other plants, they're really in a completely different subkingdom. So they're way up there. They split off. They were differences in the big scheme of things. So let's look at monocots and dicots, because that's one of the ones you'll hear the most about. So I want to take some time to compare monocots and dicots. This will come up again and again and again as master gardeners when you're looking at information and questions and all kinds of stuff. So a monocot, like I said, it means monocotyledonous or one seed leaf. And monocots have a sheathed leaf attachment. And I'll show you a picture in a second, but the sheath leaf attachment means where that leaf attaches to the stem, it kind of, the bottom of it wraps all the way around the stem and makes a sheath around it like a blade of grass does. It has parallel venation, which means if you look at that leaf closely, the veins run top to bottom. That's how you know it's parallel venation. That's one of the common characteristics of a monocot. It has a vascular system bundled. You have little sheaths of vascular system. The vascular system is how water moves up and down, up through the stem of the plant, and how carbohydrates move down. So these are in little bundles when you're looking at it in a monocot. So it's like threads, or if you look at a rope and it has different pieces of the twine that are all bundled in small sub-bundles. They're also known as having fibrous roots, meaning very small, pretty uniform sized roots to it. And again, we'll show these as we go on. Monocots also have flower parts that are in multiples of 3. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. When you're looking at that, you usually have rings of 3 when you're looking at the flowers very closely. And they commonly include the grasses. We think of the monocots as the grasses and their relatives. Within grasses, there's a lot of examples of monocots. Corn plants, St. Augustine grass. Now, here's one that may blow your mind, palm trees. But think about it, a palm tree has where the palm leaf, palm frond attaches to the stem. Think about how it wraps around uh, the trunk of that palm. It is a monocot. So you think about a palm tree is a giant grass plant. Bamboo is a form of grass too, even though it seems like it's woody, it's not. It is a form of grass. It is a monocot. But that palm, and this is where this really gets interesting, is if you're applying a grass herbicide, something that kills grasses, kills monocots in your yard, and you get too high of a concentration next to your palm trees, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have damage on your palm trees. So that's why something like this is important to understand how they're grouped together, that this wrapped monocot with the sheath leaves attachment, the parallel venation, there's a lot of their processes, the way that they accept chemicals, the way they react to things that are very similar, as opposed to a dicot. Sometimes we call those, again, that's dicotyledonous, or two seed leaves when they emerge out of the soil, and they have a direct leaf attachment. Sometimes we call these the broadleaf plants. You'll see that in just a second. But they have a direct leaf attachment. Like if you have a hibiscus plant, for example, think about when a hibiscus leaf is attached to a stem and it comes off, there is a little round leaf scar where that leaf was attached. It's directly attached. That leaf does not wrap all the way around the stem. So that's one of the ways you know that it is a dicot. It has that direct leaf attachment. It has netted venation. If you look at that leaf at the bottom, instead of all the veins going the same way up and down, which is parallel venation, it's going to have this inner crossing of the veins of the underside of that leaf. So that's what netted venation means. And I'll show you a few pictures as we go along. Also, the vascular system, instead of being those little bundles, it's in rings. So when you're looking at plants that grow and they have rings, then they tend to be dicots. So like a palm tree, palm trees don't have rings, but you look at an oak tree would have rings if you cut through the stem, and that's how the vascular system grows, and it's in those ring systems as you go up. Again, we'll be talking more about the transport a little bit later on in the presentation, but that's ring growth versus vascular bundles. Instead of fibrous roots, where all the roots are basically about the same size, dicots have taproot systems, which means you have larger roots to smaller roots to smaller roots. So again, you have some very large roots and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So it doesn't always mean that there's one central root going down when we talk about a taproot system. It just means you have large roots to smaller roots. And flower parts for dicots tend to be in 4s and 5s. So if you see something that has 4 petals, right there, you can look at it and say it's a dicot versus a monocot, or something that has 5 petals, like a hibiscus flower has 5 flower petals on it. So you look and go, without even looking at it very close, you can look at that flower and say, that is probably a dicot, and group it into that. There, you can take a little closer look and see, what does the vein of the leaf look like underneath it? Yes, it's got netted venation. Look, the leaf is directly attached. The roots do have big roots going to smaller roots to smaller roots. So you know it's got that taproot system to it. So you can do all of those things to kind of group them together. And again, we call these the broadleaf plants. And some of those examples are things like beans and oak trees and hibiscus and sunflowers. There's a lot of plants that are dicots. But think about this. When you go to buying chemicals, broadleaf plants, those they absorb different types of chemicals and use them differently than others types of plants. So if you have a flower bed that has sunflowers in it, or has hibiscus in it, and you're seeing grass growing in it, grass-looking plants that have parallel venation in them, and you're trying to get rid of that with a chemical, you can use a selective grass herbicide and control those weeds among the broadleafs. In the winter, lots of times our grass, our turf gets little weed seeds coming up that are things like dandelions and sow thistle and different things like that popping up, or burr clover. Those are all broadleaf plants that grow in. So you can spray for those when they're small in a turf situation with a broadleaf herbicide and not affect the grass or the turf. So again, you'll see how that monocot versus dicot is going to be really important, particularly in chemicals. And I'm going to talk about it again in just a second. It may even be the next slide. I can't remember. But let's look at a few of those things we described in the monocots first. Monocots, you'll see here, the parallel veins on the leaf. They have those long, narrow leaves to them, and the veins go from the bottom to the top. That's parallel veins on it. You'll look at the roots, see how the roots tend to be all pretty small. When it first comes out, you have a leaf sheath that comes out, and that is what we call the cotyledon. That's where you're getting that first leaf, that first seed leaf sheath coming out on this one. But the leaf that comes out is going to be just a true leaf after it. Unlike the dicots, we'll show you like a bean. And with that, you're going to see this single cotyledon coming up. And so you're going to have that little shoot coming up. You don't have two parts that come up and separate. So again, just a few things think about how a corn plant grows. That's your classic monocot look. When you look at a dicot, think about a bean. We've all done the planting the bean thing with our kids or ourselves in the past. And think about when it comes up. Now they both have endosperm. Endosperm is part of what is holding nutrients for that seed as it comes up. But there are two cotyledons that come up and that's the protector leaves when it's working its way up through the soil. And so some things here, look at the veins. You see how the veins are netted? They branch off. That's the net-like veins. When it first comes up, you have these little cotyledons that come up and then they shrivel, and then you have real looking leaves that look very different. That's part of that dicot component. And then as the roots start to grow, you have some larger, fatter roots, and then you have smaller roots that divide to smaller roots. So that's what we're talking about, more of a taproot system, as opposed to the fibrous root system where all of them are about the same. Some plants are easier to identify certain characteristics than others on. So again, big overview, monocots versus dicots. Think of it that way. Another classification system we sometimes use is the life cycle classification system. And for us, that's a very practical way to look at things. How do plants grow? How long, when we're talking about a life cycle, is how long does it take to complete its life cycle? And some of those terms that you'll be familiar with as a master gardener is you hear about annuals. Annuals are plants that complete their life cycle in a year or less. And that's going from a seed growing, flowering, producing another seed, and that plant typically dies and it's where it's naturally occurring. So that's an annual, completing its whole life cycle in a year or less and typically dying. Then we have a biennial. And biennial, bi means 2 years, completes its life cycle in 2 years. Or basically, it's not always 2 years. It doesn't always take 24 months, but 2 growing seasons. And the first stage of what you see in these plants has a very distinctive period where it has vegetative growth. Vegetative growth are going to be your roots, your stems, and your leaves. It's developing a good, strong root system. It's getting a lot of leaves. It's getting a lot of stems so that it's ready to go into flower and produce other seeds. But annuals, lots of times you'll see both flowering and both vegetative and reproductive happening at the same time, where you have this distinctive period where you have primarily vegetative growth versus primarily reproductive growth in the life cycle. And some things that can reduce the season for biennials, things like vernalization, meaning cold dormancy. You have hot and cold periods that may reduce the time of vernalization. And some things that are out there that are considered biennials. Asparagus is considered biennial. You often will buy asparagus sprouts and plant them. If you plant it from a seed, you're not going to get it that first year when you plant your garden. So that's why you plant asparagus sprouts. Cabbage can be grown from seeds, but it really does have two distinctive components to it. It is considered a biennial because you have that distinctive leaf growth component to it, where it is making that head. But when it goes into reproductive mode, there's no going back, and it bolts. And so that's what you see why cabbage is often considered by some people life cycles. And this is where it gets really, there's this haziness. One person will consider this a biennial, someone else will consider it an annual. So again, there's a lot of gray area in some of these. Parsley is another one of those. It's considered you'll get primarily leaves that first year. If you continue to let it grow for a long period, then it'll go into flower mode and you won't get very many leaves, and then it dies. So that's why it's sometimes lumped in there. Hollyhocks are kind of in there. You plant hollyhock seeds, you don't get a lot of flowering for a while. You're going to have a lot of growth. Onions, a lot of times we'll put out onion sets in the fall because they're going to take a period of time to grow into the full mature onions that we see. So those are some that horticulturally are often lumped into biennials. And sometimes even bluebonnets are lumped in there because we'll plant them in the fall. They'll go through a primarily vegetative period of growth where you get small little crowns with small leaves growing close to the ground. Then it vernalizes. It goes through a cold period over the winter. And then in the spring, when it warms back up, then it'll go just into flower mode and finish flowering. So that's why sometimes even bluebonnets are considered a biennial. It's the characteristic of how it grows. It grows with that very vegetative period of growth, followed by a very reproductive growth, and then it dies. Then the third type you often see, and a lot of plants fall into this, are perennials. Perennials are plants that grow for many years. They live for a lot of years. And, that's where our shrubs hit. That's where a lot of our herbaceous plants hit. Hibiscus and Esperanza and rosemary, all those types of things. We want them to grow for multiple years. An oak tree, you want an oak tree to live for multiple years. It's going to be a perennial. And a lot of our herbaceous plants, you'll have plants that will grow. Spider lilies and cannas, and again, Mexican bush sage and all kinds of plants fall under perennials. So, we like to put things in these nice, neat things of annuals and biennials and perennials. And we wish they all acted exactly the way we want them to act because, humans tend to be control freaks and like it their way. But nature doesn't always do that. So then there's some other terms you may hear that are kind of the exceptions or things that don't match the way we originally put them into groupings. I was once told in biology, there are no absolutes. There's always an exception somewhere. So, and one of those is things that aren't so simple in life cycles is this term, you may hear the word perennialize. These are plants that usually in most places are only going to last for a year. But in other areas, they may last for multiple years, depending on the weather conditions. And the example I always use, and I love to use this example, are vinca or periwinkles. You go to the nursery, you're going to buy periwinkles in the annual section. They typically grow for a year. But I've had periwinkles at my mom's house that have been there for 5 and 6 years because she lives in Rockport and it's mild there and they've been growing and they have big fat stems to them and they keep coming back year after year and they don't completely freeze to the ground. So we have termed that perennialized. And then there are some plants that we go, that's obviously a perennial, that are used in northern climates as annual color. They only want it to last for a season. And so like you go up to Chicago and places like that, they'll use firebush or Esperanza as an annual up there. They expect it to die and to replace it next year, but it gives them a lot of color for that season. So they use it like an annual, knowing it's going to freeze. So again, the life cycle. As horticulturists, we go and we use it as when it's convenient for us, as opposed to the biologist. A biologist is going to be very specific and look at the structures and the components. So again, gardeners and horticulturists are very different than a botanist or a biologist in how they view things. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Back to weeds, there's when we look at things from a horticultural standpoint, we divide weeds into three groupings, typically two big ones, and then one kind of as a subgroup. But when you're talking about weeds, a lot of people will talk about grasses. Again, that's our monocots for the most part. Those are the monocots. And then we'll talk about broadleaf weeds. Those are our dicots. And then we'll also talk about sedges. Sedges are a family within the monocots, and they have very waxy leaves to them. They have very distinct edge on the leaf, and they typically have a triangular shape. Anyone has ever fought nut sedge? Nut sedge is our classic local weed sedge, and you can use a grass herbicide on it, and it'll turn it a little bit yellow, but it's not enough. And it's because of that waxy coating on it. That's why they're sometimes lumped into a different group when we classify weeds. But a grass, again, monocots there, that parallel vein in its system, the small fibrous root system, broadleafs, having the netted veins, flower parts in 4s and 5s, and then those sedges, which are basically just call them very temperamental grasses that will resist stuff. So basically you have to get the chemical to stick to those sedges, and that's why they're lumped in when we talk about weeds separately, as opposed to just the grasses. And this is all back to how the plants absorb chemicals, what types of chemicals they absorb, and how they process those chemicals. Some of the chemicals that work on grasses do not work on broadleafs. That's why we can have those, we call those selective herbicides if it works just on grasses or just on broadleafs. So that mode of action, and that's how we use a chemical control of those weeds. And then the other one you may see, instead of just broadleaf or grass herbicide, you may see what we call a broad spectrum herbicide. Broad spectrum means it kills everything. That's where your glyphosate or Roundup comes in. It is all kinds of plants will absorb that, and it can be toxic to them. And then depending on the amount that you apply and the time you apply it and things like that will determine how much effect it has on those plants. So a broad spectrum pretty much kills everything. A grass herbicide kills grasses, but not the broadleaves. And then a broadleaf herbicide just kills those broadleaf weeds. So understanding that, getting a broad knowledge of that as a gardener, as a horticulturist, how we look at that classification. So later on, you'll be familiar with that. One other thing that we talk about with plants are zone classifications. You may have heard, well, this is a zone 8 plant, or and when you're talking about zones, what we're referring to is the USDA plant hardiness zone map. That is typically when we're talking about zones, plants being in certain zones, that's what we're talking about. With that, let me show you what that is. That hardiness zone map is updated every 20, 30 years or so. There was an update about 8 years ago. And it is representing the average low temperature, which then, what that average low temperature is, will then let you know the freeze hardiness of certain plants. If plants typically freeze within this range of temperatures, then it's not hardy in that range of what the temperatures may be. And these are 10-degree ranges on the map that they look at the average low temperature. Average. Sometimes you'll look at plants and they'll be said, oh, this is a zone 3 to 6 plant. Well, technically it's not. Uh, they're trying to say that these are plants that like cooler temperatures. They don't handle hot temperatures a lot, but that's not really the best way to look at it. They are commonly found in zones 3 to 6, but the coldest that it can take is what's represented in zone 3, because the smaller the number, the colder the temperature. Zone 10 is very tropical. Zone 3 is very cold. So if you see someone saying this is a zone 3 to 6 plant, it's like it's really a zone 3 plant, but it doesn't appear to do well in the warmer climates, and that's why they do that, because people can kind of see on that map where it hits, meaning it grows in those zones, but technically it's only a zone 3 plant. So that's one of those things that I'm kind of a stickler about. Everyone has one of those things. I just wanted to make sure you're reading the map right and understand it, and how we sometimes misuse that map. And these plants, typically when you see something like that, it means that not only does it may not survive in the hot weather, sometimes it actually needs a certain amount of cold weather in order to continue to grow or to flower. So that's another reason that those cooler plants may grow for a short period down south, but they may not live long term. For those of you that may have relocated from the Midwest and it gets really cold, you will probably hear at some point someone asking about, I want to grow peonies down here, and it just doesn't get cold enough for peonies in South Texas. So you talk a lot about apples. A lot of people are used to growing apples up north. Those are temperate fruit trees, and they need a certain amount of cold weather in order to produce and flower uniformly. We don't get enough cold weather for apples down here. So again, you'll kind of see how some plants need cold weather, and it's not just the survival component when we zone a plant. So if you want to look at the U.S. plant hardiness zone map, this is what it looks like. Here we are in Corpus Christi, way down here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. We are in zone 9A, and the Rio Grande Valley below us is slightly darker orange, is zone 9B. That's a 5-degree increment where we have split up the temperatures. So when you're looking at this, our lowest temperature, typically our average lowest temperature is no more than 20 degrees, where it's 20 Fahrenheit. And this is based on degrees Fahrenheit, because of course we're Americans and that's how we're going to do it. Make it easy for us. And in the valley, 25 degrees is the typical average low temperature. There are always exceptions. There's times, we got to 17 degrees or 18 degrees 2 years ago. That's not common. So that is an outlier. Doesn't mean we never get colder than 20 degrees, but typically we don't. And so if a plant can survive to 20 degrees, it's considered a zone 9 or a 9A. If it can take a little bit colder weather, if it can't take the colder weather, sometimes it's considered that 9B. So understanding the A's and B's. From here, that's 9. The brown tones here are zone 8 into central Texas. Zone 7 is going to be the pink and the reds, with the red being the 8B versus 8A. The dark yellow is going to be 7B versus the light yellow is 7A. 6 is the greens. Then you go into the purple tones for 5, and I believe 4 is the orange. So it keeps moving its way up. As you see, there's a couple of things. Not only does it move up as you go higher, closer to the north, the North Pole, you'll also see some anomalies based on elevation. When you have areas that are very high, like here in the Rocky Mountains, this colder region gets further down because of elevation through here. And even in Texas, this part of the Panhandle, the high plains, is going to be colder, than not just because of where it falls from the North Pole, but just due to elevation. So as you move down, you're getting closer, lower elevations, and you're getting closer to the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico has a warming influence, and that's why this brown line doesn't just go straight across and stop up near Rockport or Port Lavaca. It goes all the way along the coast because the barrier islands and those coastal regions tend to stay a little bit warmer than even just 10 miles to the inland. So that's why we have 9A that stretches all along the coast and even into Louisiana. So when you look at Florida, you'll see that 9A where we are, that's Central Florida up to Jacksonville, Gainesville, where I lived for a while, and over into St. Petersburg. Then you get into the 9B, which is a little layer. Then you get into zone 10 when you get into deep south. You get into the Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Naples area. They're a little warmer than we are. And so they're going to be a zone 10 there, as well as in Hawaii. So kind of giving you a feel of how that all works. That's our plant hardiness zone map. In Texas, looking at it a little closer, again, here's 9B in the valley. This actually has the counties shown on here, the 254 counties in the state of Texas. So here's the Rio Grande Valley in 9B, deep, what we call the Deep Valley. You have the 9A, which goes all the way along the coast. And then there's a few little pockets here and there where it gets a little colder on average. And then you have here's 8B, 8A, and then you have some little pockets here. Those are some hilly areas that are a little bit further north. And then you go up into the 7B, 7A, 6B, 6A, and then you're into 5s when you get into the green here. So this lets you see those temperature range. So here we are, 9A, that's where we are. Our average low temperature, it's not uncommon for us to have temperatures, in the 25 to 20 to 25 degree range every few years. It may not be for a long time. It may only be for a couple of hours, but we get into the low 20s periodically. It's not common for us to get into the teens, to get below 20. And that's why we are in 9A, so that the anomaly of 2 years ago, where we got to 18 degrees, that's an anomaly. But these are based on averages. And I once had a professor tell me there's 3 types of people in the world. Averages are a form of stats. We look at statistics, and that is over a long period of time. You take all those temperatures, you divide it by the number of years. That's how you find out the average low temperature. What's that low temperature? So you have within the people, you have people that are liars, then you have darn liars, and he said then you have statisticians. They're their own little group of people and how they look at things. So averages make liars out of all of us. So just be aware that you say, well, we're 9A, 20 to 25 degrees. Guess what? It got 18 degrees. Well, you told me that we're 9A. How did it get to 18 degrees? That's how. It's an average. Just letting you know how that works. Here it is a little bit prettier. Maybe this is easier for you to look at color-wise. I just got this from a different website. Same basic thing as you're looking at it by county. Another thing that's kind of a variation of this is when we're talking about temperate fruit in particular, and some temperate flowers and even flower bulbs, we talk about chilling hours, and there are zones for chilling hours. And dormancy and the requirement for chilling hours is a survival mechanism of temperate plants. Temperate plants are those that live in areas where I say there's a true winter. And because there's cold weather, those plants, to survive, they redirect their carbohydrates and slow down their life processes for the winter. They go dormant. And then when the conditions are right, then they're going to go back into growing, trying to survive that cold weather, that harsh condition, and protect their resources. And so we see that with fruit, what we call temperate fruit. And those, again, those are apples and pears and peaches. And you'll see it in flowers like azaleas are temperate. they need a certain amount of cold weather to bloom. There's a few that need a lot less, and so there's a few we may be able to grow. Blueberries fall in that. So, and then even within flower bulbs, there are some flower bulbs that need cold weather, a certain amount of cold weather in order to initiate their flowers. So that's why we don't see tulips here in South Texas, where you can see them in other areas as you go further north, and they'll come back year after year in other areas, but they're not going to here. So, unlike the average cold temperature on the USDA map, I'll tell you, calculating chilling hours or chilling units is a lot more difficult, and we'll talk about that a little more later, or we'll review that again when we come back to plant processes when I finish this lecture on Monday. But to give you an overview, plants are these areas in Texas, you'll see, this is an area here that gets around 200, what we call accumulates 200 chill units in the winter. And then there's this region along the coast and a little further north that accumulates up to 400 chill units. So the further south you are, probably, this is like a 400 chill unit line. So as you get further south, this may be, getting closer to 300 as we're moving down. And moving into this, but this area should typically get at least 200 chill units. This area typically gets at least 400 chill units. Then the next region we go to 600, and then 700, 800, 1,000, 1,200 as you get up back to higher elevations. And where we are longitudinally, we're much further north. So there's a lot of things that can affect the amount of cold weather we get up north. And also, you just look at the amount when the cold fronts come down. How far down do they get before they stop? This sure looks a lot like those weather maps that we see, and how the cold fronts kind of stretch down and then they loop over. You're seeing that same pattern. So again, try to look in the broad scheme of things as we look at this. This is the reason why even within the state of Texas, it's difficult to know what to do with fruit. And as master gardeners, people love to grow their own fruit in their backyard. It's very difficult for us in South Texas because we only get 400 chill units or so down in this area. So we have to be very careful on the varieties that we pick. I've had people that moved even from Dallas down into Corpus Christi or on the island or Port Aransas, and they'll go, I had this great peach tree up north and it was just the best, and it gave me the best peaches. Or some people will go, well, I went to Fredericksburg, our peach capital of the state of Texas, and there was this great peach, and I asked them what it was, and they gave me the name of it, and I got this peach and I just can't get it to produce. Why? You're looking up here, Dallas Fort Worth gets about 800 chill units. You're looking at Fredericksburg, you're looking at 600 to 700 chill units back over here. It's significantly colder there. Those trees are adapted for survival to say it needs a certain amount of cold before it knows it's safe for it to flower and flower consistently. And so the peaches that grow in Fredericksburg or grow up here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area probably are not going to flower nearly as consistently down here in South Texas in Corpus Christi as they would in those other areas. So that's why it's important. That's when you're looking at fruit trees, you need to look at the tag, look at the varieties on those tags, and look at those chill units and recommend those plants, those varieties that do well with lower chill units. And that's why ordering from catalogs can be very difficult for people. They'll see something and it's described and it does great, and it takes a wide range of conditions, but it may only do well in North Texas because it needs colder weather. It needed 700, 900 chill units to do well. The other thing is, if you have something that needs 800 chill unit and it's down here in South Texas in Corpus Christi, we get 400, it never gets cold enough. So you may get a few flowers, you may get a few fruit, you'll get but instead of, we're used to fruit trees blooming all at once, and then you get a whole lot of fruit producing all at one time and maturing. You may get 4 or 5 flowers now, and a couple of weeks later, you get 2 or 3 more flowers. That's the plant just slowly saying, well, we're going to take a shot at it and see, but you're not going to get that production that you're used to seeing, that uniform production. So that's how chill units kind of work. And you see, as you get closer to the coast or further south, the chill units, that amount of chill unit accumulation is lower. As you go further north, you get a little more as you get further north, or you get into higher elevations, because again, this is the high plains and the rolling plains over here. So you can see that's why this does not go straight across, but it's more at this angle that's based on the panhandle. And that's all about elevations in the state of Texas. And then lots of times you'll see more even out here in West Texas, because you have the Davis Mountains out here. So that's why you see a little variation in there too. Okay. Chill units are not always uniform, because let me see what my next slide is real quick. Okay, here it is within the US. So even within Florida, you go, well, I've been to Florida and it's at the same where we are on the map longitudinally. Well, Florida is surrounded by water. You forget about that. So it has warming effect on 2 sides. So it stays warmer even higher up. So what works over here in Orlando may not work exactly the same over here in Texas. And what works in Miami, you go, well, it looks like it's straight across. It needs even lower chill units to work over there. So just letting you see how it stretches across the US. That's the chill unit zones. The last thing I wanted to just tell you now, so we can do it as review next time, is chill units are an accumulation, and it's not a 1-for-1 accumulation. When we say you need 100 hours or 400 hours of chill units are when that plant is perceiving cold weather approximately at 32 to 35 degrees, 33 to 35 degrees. At that point, it's a 1-for-1 chill unit accumulation. When it gets a little bit warmer, 35 to 40, it's probably about an 80% hour to hour. When you get 40 to 45, you're more in the 60 to 75% range. You get above 45, you're getting less than half of a chill unit accumulation per hour, because it's not as cold. The chemicals that change and are accumulated in the plant react different if it's not quite as cold. So, and then the thing is, when you have those, you may have a long period of time where, we're in cold weather here in South Texas in December, and then it gets warm in January. And then it gets cold again in late January, early February. In that warm period, you start losing chill units. That the longer it stays above 50 degrees, you start deteriorating that accumulated chill unit by that plant. So there's this whole mathematical model component. And I dealt with this for 4 years, working on a doctorate at the University of Florida in azaleas. So there's still a lot of questions, and it just depends on how accurate your model is for that particular plant variety in that particular condition. So again, there's a lot of gray area when you're looking at chill unit accumulation. So next, what we're going to do, we have about an hour left. I want to try to get through the vegetative plant parts of a plant, that part of basic botany next. So with that, I told you before, there's 2 types of plant growth. There's vegetative plant growth and there's reproductive plant growth. And with that, there's plant parts, or technically plant organs, that fall within vegetative growth and reproductive growth. The plant organs associated with vegetative growth are those that we most commonly think of. They're roots, stems, and leaves. A root is a vegetative portion of the plant. The stem is a vegetative portion. The leaf is a vegetative portion. Reproductive parts are going to be the flower, the fruit, and the seed. And nuts are kind of their own special thing. So anyway, but flower, fruit, nuts, and seeds, those are all the reproductive components of the plant. And so sometimes the plant is in more vegetative state due to the hormone balance. A lot of this deals with hormones within the plant. The reproductive state means that it's trying to complete its life cycle to make sure there's a future generation. So once the chemicals change into that, sometimes it's hard to reverse it back into vegetative growth. And that's all species dependent. So here, things we're familiar. We know what a root is. We know typically what a stem is, what a leaf is. That flower, the flowers come in a lot of areas along the plant. Typically they're up near the tips. And flowers are actually, parts of those flowers are modified leaves. We'll talk about that later. However, within this, we're going to be talking about tissues. There are tissue systems as well as plant parts. The tissues within a leaf or a stem or whatever, you have the dermal tissue, which is the exterior, the edge, or what in us, our dermis is our skin. So think about it as the dermal tissue being the skin of the plant, the outside cells. And then you have a vascular system. Vascular is moving stuff up and down through the plant. It's taking water and nutrients from the roots and moving them up into the leaves and through the stems. It's taking carbohydrates that are being made in the green parts and the leaves and the stems and moving them down to other parts of the plant, because guess what? There's no light and no green chlorophyll down in the roots. So it's not actively making food. So we've got to supply food to the root system. So that's the vascular system. That's transportation is what the vascular system does. And then we have what biologists call the ground system or the fundamental system. That's the building blocks. That's the basic part. That's the stuff that gives you the rest of your stem that's not actively growing. It's the center part of your fruit, the mesocarp, the middle part, or the endocarp that you're eating. So that's that interior part. So it's just the way the cells are made and what they do is a little different. So you may see tissue systems within plants, or if we're talking about organs, typically we're talking about the flowers, the stems, the leaves, the roots, and the seeds. So that's the difference between a system, a plant system, and a plant organ. Then there's some other terms, and I just want you to see some of the terminology here. Let me move that over just a bit if it'll let me. It's not going to let me. Okay, so a few terms you may hear. I just want you to be familiar with these. So if another instructor comes in later, you're not going like, oh, I don't have a clue what they're talking about. For instance, if someone talks about a terminal bud, the terminal is the end. And you think about it, an airline terminal, when you go to get on your flight, it's at the end of the walkway. It's not where you start at the airport, it's at the end. A train terminal is at the end of the train line or where you're boarding it. So that the terminal bud is going to be the end bud at the end of a branch. When we talk about axils, an axillary bud, a leaf axil is this angle where the leaf between the leaf and the stem. That is the leaf axil, is the angle. So guess what? If you have a little bud with inside that leaf axil, that's going to sometimes be called an axillary bud. Just so that you're somewhat familiar with that. Sometimes those are also called lateral buds because it will help the plant to spread. So there's, depending on whether you're looking at a horticulturist or you're talking from a biology standpoint, you may see a little bit of variation in that as well. Here, another term I want you to see is this term of a node and an internode. A node is the spot where a leaf is attached to the stem. That is the node where the leaf is attached. So if we're talking about a monocot, remember it has a sheathed leaf attachment. So it's going to have a long node that wraps around the stem. Think about a corn stalk. It has those little segments. It looks like little circles going around the stem. Those are all nodes. The internode is the distance between two nodes. So between this leaf over here and this leaf over here, you have an internode. And so that is that distance in the middle, in between the nodes, internode. So just want you to be familiar with that. The vascular system, like I just talked about before, that's the part that's moving up and down through the stem. It also, the vascular system is what the vein of the leaf is. That's part of the vascular system within that vein. So it's just moving materials up and down through the plant stems and through the plant leaves. Within the root, there's a few things to look at. A primary root is going to be the major root that, back up. So the root cap, some various things. Primary root is going to be one of the major root, or one of the major roots from the stem, where the main central part of the plant is. A lateral root are those that split off from the side, and so that's a split, or one of those first side roots. And then those will split again and split again. Root hairs are on the tips of the roots, and that's really where water and nutrients are absorbed. Root hairs are extensions of, they are the extensions of the root cells, those dermal cells. They're not even individual cells, they're just an extension there. And they have thinner walls that allow the water and the nutrients and chemicals to pass through there. So then we also have, at the very tip of a root, we're going to have a root cap, and I'll show you this a little bit more later. The root cap is at the very tip, and that root cap is really kind of like a hard hat that helps that root move through the soil. It's there for protection. So just some terms I want you to be able to understand. Root is when we talk about the root of the plant, it's pretty much all that stuff that's below the ground, even though there are some stems that are technically below. And when we talk about the shoot of the plant, that's all that above ground stuff. When we talk about a plant shoot, it's all the above ground. It's leaves, it's stems, and sometimes flowers too. So again, lots of gray area. Let's go and talk about the roots specifically. There are different types of roots. We talked about a few of these roots earlier. I wanted to make sure you're familiar with them. The first root type that we have, here we go, fibrous roots. Fibrous roots are what we find on monocots. We talked about that earlier. There's lots of small, relatively small roots. Are all about the same size. So they make this intertwined netting of very small roots. So think about, grass. When you pull up grass, all the roots are roughly the same size. You don't have some really fat grass roots and then get to smaller grass roots and smaller grass roots. They may get a little smaller, but not tons. You don't get like 4-inch grass roots typically, and then go down to, tiny 1/8 of an inch grass roots. They're all about that same 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, typically. And same thing when you pull up a palm tree, you all have about 1/2 inch roots, 1/4 to a 1/2 inch roots on palm trees. You don't have big old fat roots going down into the ground for a palm. So that's a fibrous root versus a taproot system. And there's different types of taproot systems. And so I wanted to get you familiar with some of those subcategories of taproots. The taproots that are types of taproots you may hear is a fattened, F-A-T-T-E-N, fat taproot, which means you have a primary root and it gets large and it's a storage unit. So you have a fattened taproot, which are things we're familiar with. A carrot, we're turnips and radishes, those are fattened taproots. Then you may have what we call a primary taproot, where you have a very deep primary single root that goes down, and it's going to be very distinct that you're going to see one primary root going down. And so dandelions, true dandelions, tend to have that going down. It has a very big fat root, primary root going out. And you'll have a couple of others going out, but you have a big fat one going down. Then after that, you're going to have what we call equal taproots, which are things that most of our shrubs have. Oaks, hibiscus, sunflowers, things like that are going to have a lot of roots that are all about the same size. Well, they get large ones, then smaller ones, then smaller ones. So you'll have what we call that primary roots, and then you get to a secondary size and a tertiary size. They get slightly smaller as you get further away. So I just kind of wanted you to be familiar with some of those terms. So here's a couple of pictures of those, just so that you are ready to see that visually. So that fattened or swollen taproot, like a carrot, and you'll see that long primary taproot. You see the blazing star. Blazing star is Liatris, if you didn't know what that is. So that gives you that big fat root. You get a lot of fat roots there. Sunflowers give you that example. You have several larger roots coming out. They're pretty large, and then they branch off more. But if you look at something like oats or corn or a lot of your grasses, your roots are all about that same size. And that's a very fibrous type root system. So this gives you a little visual of a fattened taproot, a primary taproot, a equal taproot, and then the fibrous root system. I hope that helps you to visually see that terminology a little bit better. Okay, and moving on, let's talk a little bit about what roots do. The functions of roots, first and foremost, roots are there for support and anchorage. Plants don't move around, unlike animals, dogs and cats and stuff that move around. Plants don't. They stay in one spot. So you kind of have to need something to hold them in place. And that's one of the things that roots really do. Otherwise, your plants are going to wash away and they're going to get drowned down a river somewhere. Then next, you're going to have roots that absorb water and nutrients. That's the other key thing that they do. You got to have roots. Plants don't get a lot of water, and there's a few adaptations. Again, there's always the exception, but plants primarily are getting water and nutrients from the root system, from the water in the soil. So if you don't have good, strong roots, you're not going to have a good, strong plant growth above. And that's why roots are so important to have good roots, because that's where water and nutrients are coming from. The other thing that they do, particularly those fattened taproots, they can be a place where carbohydrates or food is stored. The true food of a plant is the carbohydrates that are being made. They are sugars. They are stored sugars. When we give nutrients, we give fertilizers to a plant, we sometimes say that we're feeding that plant, but that's not really plant food. Those are nutrients that are in the fertilizer. So please recognize that the true food, plants make their own food. They make their own carbohydrates using nutrients and light and water and carbon dioxide. So that's what they do in photosynthesis. They don't make nutrients, which is what we sometimes incorrectly call plant food. So again, one of those things I'm kind of a stickler about, just so that you understand. And let's see. Within a root, there's a couple of things that you need to be familiar with on the way a root is designed, particularly the tips of the roots. Here, you're seeing the bottom part of a root, and the very, very, very tip of the root there's a root cap. And those are just their nondescript cells, parenchyma cells. And their whole job is basically there for protection. They are the hard hat of the root. Because as a root grows, it pushes down through the soil. And just like if you're rubbing against a concrete wall, which sometimes our soil feels like concrete around here, but if you're rubbing against a concrete wall on your skin, it's going to scrape off the outside layer of your skin periodically. And that's what the root cap is doing, is that root is pushing through the soil. It has to have certain number of cells that are basically sacrificial cells. It's allowing the root to keep moving, because just behind that is an area we call the meristem, where cell mitosis is happening. That's cell division. That's where lots of new cells are being produced. Those cells are dividing and dividing and dividing, and they're tiny, but it's making more cells. And as you make more cells, it pushes that root further through the soil. Roots, again, they keep adding to the tip. Plants add their growth to the tip, whether it is a branch growing or it's a root growing. They keep growing downward. They grow further away. So it's like adding on to the ends, and the bottom keeps multiplying. And that's this area of cell division or mitosis. Just below that, or I guess as you go up the stem, after those cells divide, and they're very tiny when they divide, the next thing that they do is those cells start to elongate. They fill themselves up full of water. They get bigger. They're just stretching with adding water so that those cells get larger. That is that area of cell elongation. So you have a root cap, you have the cell mitosis or cell division area, and then you have this area of elongation. And again, they're still pretty nondescript. They're just basic cells. And then after that, we get into an area of what we call the zone of maturation. And at that point, I say those cells are getting a job. In that area of the root, they're differentiating, they're changing, they're turning into different types of cells. They're adapting based on what that root needs. The outside layer, which is our dermal area, you're going to have some of those cells that start having these extensions that come out, and that's the root hairs that come out. You're going to have some of those that are inside that are going to be the phloem and the xylem. They're going to turn into interior parts that create the vascular system of the plant. So that's going to give you xylem and phloem to the inside. And so that's important for you to realize that as well. And then you're going to have other areas of the stem that may just change and store food. And that's going to be cortex cells. So they become water storage or food storage cells within there. And then you have areas in the very center of those roots, or even in your stems, that are there for more support, and they suberize. They have other chemicals that are put in there, and they're there for the strength of that root. It's kind of like reinforcing the interior cells. So it's there for the strength. So there's lots of different things, and that happens not right after they're not made that cell. All cells are made the same pretty much as these parenchyma cells or nondescript cells. They go in and divide and change as they get older. So and as they move further up into the root, as that root gets older, they change. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. So what happens when you cut the root tips off, you've cut off its ability to make roots. And so then some of these cells that are cortex cells that are kind of nondescript, they have to change again. And it takes time for that to happen within the root. So that's why we protect our root system, particularly the root tips, because that's going to, if we get rid of our root tips, then it's going to take longer for those roots to divide and make more roots. So protecting your root tips is really important because that's where new roots are coming from. Clear as mud so far, or roots in mud. Some of the things we use the root, we use roots for, because I said the function of a root is how a plant uses it. And that's things for like support and food storage and absorption of water and minerals. But for people, we use roots for let's face it, we're selfish as human beings. We want everything to be for our benefit. So how do we do that? One of those things that we do is we use them for food, or we use them as crops. So you will have crop roots, and those are going to be your turnips and your carrots and things like that. That's one way we use roots. People also use roots of plants for erosion control, and we forget about that. But it is important that when we have bare ground, it's the roots of the plants that keep that soil from washing away. And so you want, if you're having an area that has a hill or something, or you're worried about erosion, you want a plant that's going to have a lot of roots and fill that up in it very quickly. And that's why we plant so much grass in bare areas, because they have fibrous roots. And those fibrous roots will hold that soil in place and keep it from washing out. And it grows very quickly. If you try holding the root in place by planting oak trees, it's going to take a long time, and a lot of that soil is going to wash away. So again, erosion control is one way we use them. Soil improvement, you go, how do you use roots for soil improvement? Well, guess what? Those roots, if they are cut off or they're left in the soil and they die, they add organic matter back into the soil. They also, as they die, they leave spaces and allow more soil aeration as they decay, and that allows more water penetration. So the roots of plants can benefit us in the way we grow our plants. And so that's kind of how we use roots. So that's the first point, because I said we have roots, we have stems, and we have leaves. So let's move from roots and go into stems. I think we can get stems and basic leaf done before we hit the noon hour or the 1 o'clock hour today. So, and then we'll see if I have a little time for questions. I'll try to leave a little bit before we leave. And if we run a little bit long, you're welcome to stay and ask questions after 1 today, if you have questions. Stems. So the next thing is the function of stems. How do plants use stems? What's the importance of stems to plants? And one of them that we rarely really think about is support and structure. Have you ever thought about it? A plant that has no stems to it, all you'd have is this little stack of leaves right on the soil surface. And we have some plants that are very short and have very short stems, but it is the stem that takes a shrubby type plant or a perennial plant and spreads out those leaves, and it gives it structure, it gives it support. It's the framework that those leaves are attached to. And because of that, it allows those leaves to spread out and be more efficient for photosynthesis, for being able to absorb carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, to provide protection for the other leaves and stems below. So it's that structure. And we don't think about plant stems giving structure to the plant and why that's so important to the plant itself. The other thing is, a lot of our vascular system is in the stems. Remember, what did the roots do? They absorbed water and nutrients. What do you think needs water and nutrients? The leaves need it. So you got to connect the root system to the leaves where photosynthesis is happening. So it is a conductive system that moves water and nutrients from the root system up to the leaves and moves the carbohydrates, the foods, from the leaves back down for storage. So there's a lot of stuff moving around through the stems. And along that way, as water is being moved, hormones are also being moved with the water up and down. So conductivity is huge in stems. Transport is really important for stem function. And then food storage, carbohydrates. There are some stems that store a lot of carbohydrates in them. And one you may not think about In fact, I'll wait a minute because I think I got a picture of this coming up. But there are some stems that store a lot of carbohydrates. So think about that as food storage in terms of that plant wanting to store carbohydrates for the future. And then propagation is also another. Some plants are wanting to make more. They want to survive. They want to spread. And those stems, as those stems lay over, can root very easily, or you can. So for the plant, the stem is the most practical way to start a new plant other than a seed in terms of propagation. So it's really important. And then photosynthesis. If it's a green stem like celery, or remember the kapok tree that I showed you those green stems on, it's going to have some photosynthesis in there. Leaves are typically the most efficient in place of it, but it can happen in the stem, which is important early in the season when there are no leaves on some plants. How does man use the stem? I mean, first of all, where would we be without tree stems? What is it that we get from tree stems? Lumber. Also food, food crops that are stems. Celery is a type of stem we eat. Potato, that was one of those. That's that trick question is, what is one of the most productive stems? And it's the potato, because if you think about those things that grow on the side of the potato, if you leave them in your pantry for too long, those eyes, those are lateral stems, which means that where there is a lateral stem coming out, there had to be a branch. That means that it's part of a stem. So those are actually, each of those eyes is a node on the stem. So a potato is a modified stem called a tuber. And then an onion, and you go, well, an onion is really just leaves, but you think about it, the center of the onion, when you cut that onion down the middle, what's in the center of the onion? It's that little tiny compressed stem in there with fleshy leaves all around it. So we eat the leaf part, but the very center of that onion is technically a stem. So those are some examples of foods that we eat that are stems. If you eat the whole onion, you're eating the stem in the middle. And then I mentioned before, lumber and food, or lumber and wood. When we have boards, those are just stems, plant stems, and we don't think about them that way. So without plant stems, without tree trunks, tree stems, we would really have difficulty in the way we live and things that we do. We wouldn't be able to build fences, and a lot of our homes have wood components within them. So furniture, lumber is an important part of using stems. Fibers, there are some types of plant stems that have very long fibers within them, and those can be woven or used. And it is the stem, those vascular points within the stem, that are interwoven to make like rope out of hemp. And canaf is another one of those. That's an alternative. Mulch. As gardeners, we use a lot of mulch, and there's a lot of things you can use for mulch. You can use grass clippings with a lot of grass leaves. You can use plant leaves, oak tree leaves are a type of mulch. But one of the most efficient type is using that stem, using that wood that's been chopped up, or the bark that's been chopped up, because it lasts longer. There's the way a lot of the cells within the stem are suberized. They have coatings within them that prevent them from breaking down very quickly. So that's why mulch is another way that we use stems very commonly. And then if we want to make new plants, we use the stem to make new plants. So let's talk about a few of the modified stems. I already told you about one of them, but let's talk about how sometimes stems are modified. Every plant stem's not the same. Every plant leaf's not the same. There's modifications. Plants change in order to adapt to their environments or their needs. So that's why some plants have thorns and some don't. Some have big leaves, some have small leaves. And same thing with animals. And you look at that, why some birds are very colorful or have very long beaks on them or bills. So again, different modifications. So let's look at it in terms of plant stems. One of the ones you may hear about is a rhizome. And this is a key word that you really need to look at. A rhizome is an underground stem. Rhizomes occur under the ground and they grow horizontally. And good examples of those are ginger. If you have ginger plants in your yard, that underground stem is a rhizome. Or a canna lily. When a canna lily grows and it grows down and across, and another one pops up and it grows across, another one pops up, those are underground and they are rhizomes because they grow horizontally and they grow under the ground. Okay. Then you go in and you look at an above ground horizontal stem is called a stolon. So if you're looking at a stolon versus a rhizome, basically it's just, is it above the ground or is it below the ground? If it's above the ground, like grass grows above the ground, you have stems growing horizontally, like St. Augustine grass does. That's a stolon versus the rhizome. And then you have some of these fattened or adjusted ones. Tubers are very fleshy stems, and they occur under the ground. So that's why potatoes, actually, if you ever grow potatoes, you have to pile dirt up around the base of the stem so that it will actually start creating the tubers. So it's a modification of that stem growing. So tubers are a fleshy underground stem. You also can have a bulb, which are those fleshy leaves. That's really the onion or like an amaryllis bulb. You have the very small stem in the very center with lots of fleshy leaves around them. That's what a bulb is. And then there's one that's kind of a modified version of that, which is a corm. And corms are like a bulb, except the leaves are not as fleshy. They don't have as much water. They have more dried leaves on the outside of them. And those are things more like a gladiolus. If you think about how it's kind of dry, that is considered a corm. So they're dried leaves surrounding that small interior stem. So when you look at it, a rhizome here, you'll see underground, it's growing horizontally. And then where these little stems come up, those are nodes where there's that little axillary bud that pops up that forms a new stem coming up above the ground. A stolon like these, probably little dandelions here of some form. I don't know what that is supposed to be. But again, you see a stem that's growing above the ground, and then at some point a new plantlet comes up, and then another one comes across and another plantlet comes up. Think about airplane plants are kind of like that. So they throw out these little stems that come out, and then they'll have plantlets on them. So that's another one. Or again, Bermuda grass or St. Augustine grass where it's above ground. Bermuda grass is one of those weird ones that actually gives you both rhizomes and stems. And that's why Bermuda grass is so hard to control. As master gardeners, you need to know that. The stem under the soil is the rhizomes that spread out underneath and where Bermuda grass is planted, but you also have those above ground stems as well. So just scraping the top off of Bermuda grass doesn't usually kill it because there's a lot of below ground stems or rhizomes. And then the bulb, again, you can see like the onion, we're familiar with that, where you have the little tiny stem down here and all these big fleshy leaves. Or you have the corm, which looks similar, but there's more dried leaves. And you'll see actually on an onion, if it's going to have bulbs come out, it's going to come from in between way in here, where on a corm, you're going to see these kind of layers, and you're going to see little side stems coming out where lateral buds are coming in between the dried leaves. So that's pictures of rhizomes, stolons, bulbs, and corms, all modified stems. So a few other types of stems that are there. You may hear these terms: an herbaceous stem versus a woody stem. An herbaceous stem is going to be soft material, lots of water in it, usually green or often green, or sometimes called the fleshy stem. And that's important when we're talking about, if you're going to eat something If you're going to eat stems, you typically are eating more fleshy stems and less woody stems, because your body will process more of the material in a fleshy stem. It's a lot easier for you to digest it. Trying to digest hard wood, your body isn't going to do that. So, and it's also important when we start talking about how we take cuttings for propagation, herbaceous stems. Some plants we want an herbaceous cutting, which is that soft, fleshy green portion, versus some plants actually root better using a woody stem, which is that harder, dark portion. And that's where you start getting a true woody stem. It's going to be much harder. And you'll actually start seeing that leaves with multiple years of growth in it as those layers of xylem and phloem harden over time, and you get more xylem being formed to the inside and more phloem to the outside. So let's look at a picture of a stem of a monocot versus a dicot. Monocot is on your left. I believe it's on your left. It's on the left on my screen. And you'll see here where it looks like lots of little dots. These are vascular bundles. And within each of these vascular bundles, you're going to have xylem and phloem. You're going to have xylem cells to the inside of the stem and phloem sides to the outside of each of these little bundles. Think of it as like little strings of rope going up, and towards the inside of that is going to be that xylem. Xylem moves water and nutrients up from the root system up through the stem, and the phloem moves the carbohydrates down from the leaves to other parts of the plant. So it's think of it that way. In a dicot, and when we were in college, if you look at them under a microscope, you're going to see large, you're going to see small xylem and large phloem points, and so cells. And so the bundles, when we were in college, they always told us to think of them as monkey faces. See the big eyes, the big round parts of the phloem in the vascular bundle, usually to the outside of the stem. So that's what the monkey face is. And then the rings and dicots is the way these plants reproduce. You have phloem and xylem. Phloem moves the carbohydrates down, and it's always to the outside of the plant. The xylem moves water and nutrients up. In a dicot, you have a ring system. And then area in the center, which is kind of support cells or its old dead components, is called the pith of a woody plant. So it's no longer functional phloem or xylem. It's just, or functional xylem to the middle. They're just structural cells in the middle. And in a monocot, monocots aren't making new xylem and phloem as that growing up. It is actually they keep growing from to the tips. They keep extending from there. Where in a dicot, you get new xylem and new phloem being produced constantly. And the part where new xylem and phloem cells are being made is this little thin layer called the cambium. That is the meristem. That is the part that's actively dividing, is the cambium. And it makes new phloem cells to the outside and new xylem cells to the inside of a woody stem. So as you keep adding layers, new cell layers kind of in the middle of that, think about it, they're in layers. As you add more xylem to the inside, it keeps pushing further out. You make more phloem and it pushes further out as well. So that old phloem that's to the outside, eventually there's more in the inside and fresh, new active xylem, and that old xylem stops. I'm sorry. Let me correct myself. To the outside edge, you have phloem, and as more phloem cells are being made by the cambium, it pushes that old phloem out. And as that old phloem is pushed out, sometimes it stops working, and that old phloem is sloughed off on the outside of a woody stem. And that old phloem that sloughs off, we call that stuff bark. And that bark is a protective layer that's protecting the phloem and the xylem to the inside. So bark is important for those plants because it is providing protection for the active phloem and the active xylem inside. So you have, this is bark or old phloem to the outside. Then you have active phloem in there that's moving carbohydrates down. You have this layer of cambium that's making new xylem cells to the inside, new phloem cells to the outside. And then you have the active xylem just inside. That's the newest, youngest xylem, moving lots of water nutrients in. Inside, just like you have old phloem that stopped working, you have old xylem to the inside. And in a tree over time, that's that old hardwood in the middle of the tree stem. That old hardwood is the inactive or old xylem to the middle. And thank goodness we have that old xylem to have lumber. That's what your lumber is made out of, is old xylem cells. So really, when you look at a big tree, it's not the whole tree that's moving water up and down. It's just a small, thin layer near the outside of a tree trunk. And that's why we often talk about needing to protect the base of trees, particularly young trees. When the bark layer is one of the biggest diseases that we have with trees in our area is what we call weed eater disease. And that is a human-induced disease where people take string trimmers, or it can be their lawnmowers, and they keep bumping the edge of a small tree, and you knock all of the bark off. Well, the bark's there for protection, but once that protective layer is gone, what gets removed next time you use the weed eater? That phloem. And if you do it often enough, or it gets deep enough, that phloem layer gets completely removed too, and then it removes the cambium. And once you remove the cambium layer, which is only 1 or 2 cell layers thick, actively dividing cells, you no longer get more phloem cells or new xylem cells. So that stem basically isn't going to grow anymore. So protecting the base of trees is important because we're protecting that old phloem, that old bark, and the active phloem underneath. If you remove that phloem layer, the problem is the roots don't have carbohydrates because they're not green. They rely on the leaves to produce carbohydrates for respiration, for life processes, for energy. And those carbohydrates have to move through the phloem down into the root system to supply them. You cut off that transportation of carbohydrates, you're on the outside of a stem, then you're going to eventually kill the roots and kill the whole plant. So I'll be talking about that again more in transportation system on Monday night. But that's because of the way ringed trees, those dicots, those woody plants are produced. The good thing is you can knock on a palm tree, you can hit it with a weed eater a lot, and there's still active phloem and xylem in the inside because it's made as those individual vascular bundles. So actually, monocots are considered to be very much a higher order plant, a more evolved plant because it's got better survival mechanisms. So that vascular system I talked to you about, xylem and phloem, I like to think of the vascular system in a stem as a transportation system, and I think of it as the interstate. And it starts with the xylem, which moves water and nutrients. You have xylem and phloem. Xylem moves water and nutrients, and it's always to the interior of the stem. So the plant is always trying to protect the water source, because without water, it's dead. So it's always protecting the water source. And it moves water and nutrients up from the roots up. Xylem moves up. And then phloem is always to the exterior of the stem, whether it's a vascular bundle or it's a ring. And it moves the carbohydrates and leaves down. From the carbohydrates in those leaves are moved down into other parts. That's a general thing. It could be somewhat sideways, but it's moving away from the leaves. So to help you remember this, a few things. Remember, xylem moves, what's it moving? It's moving upward and
Xylem moves up, phloem moves down. And the way I remembered that is xylem up was hard for me to remember, but X and U are pretty close to each other in the alphabet. Phloem, one of the master gardeners many years ago had this point. She goes, phloem flows down. Think about phloem flows down. So it's moving things down from the leaves, where xylem is moving things up. And what's being moved up? Water and nutrients. What's being moved down? Carbohydrates. So just remember that. Xylem moves up. What's moving up? Water and nutrients. Phloem flows down, flows things down. What's going down? Carbohydrates. The other quick thing, back to stems, we talked about this earlier, is the node is where a leaf is attached. Is this a monocot or a dicot based on what you're seeing here? It's going to be a monocot because you see where it's attached, it's sheathed around. So you see how it's sheathed around here. So that is going to give you a monocot here. This could be like bamboo or something like that. And in between the two nodes where this leaf is attached and this leaf is attached is the internode. You want to sound important. You know, when your stem stretches, let's say you have coleus is a great example. Coleus grows really quickly. If you put coleus in low light, you get really stretchy stems. If you put it in bright sun, they stay really short. When those stems stretch like that, if you want to impress someone, goes, look at that. That's a great example of internodal elongation. And all you're saying is that the stem between these leaves is stretching. So internodal elongation, that's one of your fun little words for the day. Let's see. Next, I'm stuck. There we go. A stem, another thing that helps you identify whether it's a stem or not is going to be whether there's leaves or leaf scars present. And again, where that leaf is attached, it's a node. And the buds where new branches come out will come from a stem. So that helps you recognize whether it's a root or a stem. And again, that node is where the leaf is attached and the space between is the internode. A picture, a few terms, again, just terminology for you to be familiar with. The terminal bud is at the terminal or at the end. The axillary bud is lateral or sideways, and it's in the axil of where that leaf was. Here's where the leaf scar was. So there's, a leaf down below here. That axillary bud was in the leaf axil or in the angle where that leaf was. Sometimes you see these little spots along, particularly young wood. They're air holes, places where air can move in and out quickly through that stem. Those are called lenticels. Sometimes you'll have a flower bud, or you'll have some, depending on the type of plant, flower buds are also made on stems, and it may be a leaf. This shows an axillary, a branch bud being in blue versus yellow for a flower. Of course, they're not really blue buds. It's just a way for them to show that. So the other thing here is growth rings, particularly on woody plants that grow a certain amount during the year, and then it seems to stop in the winter. You'll see these little areas where the cells are very compressed, and then you can see where it starts getting rapid growth, and you get this long, fast growth here. And where it stopped growing in between seasons, that's what we sometimes call growth rings. So if they're talking about a growth ring on a branch, that's what they're talking about. It's where last year's growth stopped and this year's growth has started. So that's just a term for you to look at. Non-elongated stem, terminal buds, axillary buds. When you look at a bud, as a food source, a stem as a food, it's often these buds that we're eating because that's tender. And again, that's really what cabbage or head lettuce or asparagus is. You're eating buds off the stem. So those are some fun facts about stems. We have leaves, but we're kind of running out of time, and it's fine. We can start with leaves on Monday night. I wanted to give you all a couple of minutes if anyone had other questions on what I've done. So we'll finish leaves, which is the last of our vegetative plant parts, on Monday night. and then go into the reproductive parts and then plant processes. Any questions so far for now? You're going to go, God, there's so much I can't remember it. You know what? This is a refresher course. Go back and relook at your book. Take some of the, if you've taken notes, highlighted things, just look at that back in comparison with the book and say, oh yeah, I remember him talking about that. Oh, let me read that a little bit more. This is just trying to get you thinking in terms of how these plant structures are going to affect plant growth and help you answer questions and be a better gardener, making practical choices based on what you know about the general biology of plants. With that said, anyone have a question?
If you're in class 34, you may unmute and ask Michael your questions.
I have a question.
Okay, this is Simona.
Yes, sir. I noticed on when you were talking about the stems and you mentioned crops and some of the stuff, where does sugarcane come in?
Sugarcane is it's a monocot and it is a stem, just like in this picture here. You're going to see that elongated stem, all the canes. It is a form of a stem and it's just got stored sugars within it as well as a lot of vascular system. The sugarcane, when you look at it, it's kind of stringy, and that's the vascular bundles that are inside it. But there's also a lot of stored sugar in it too, and that's how they extract the sugar in sugarcane out.
So it would be considered a crop.
It's a stem. It's a crop stem, yes. And I hadn't thought about sugarcane. I might try to remember to add that to my slides. So.
Please do. I think it's very important.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have a question or a comment? I'm always learning from y'all. Seda, did you have a question?
Yes, I have papaya trees and they are, I don't know, they look like monos, what do you call that?
Monocots. They're actually
Monocots
dicots. They don't fully wrap around. They have kind of an elongated leaf, but they don't wrap completely. The leaves don't completely wrap around. Don't have a sheathed leaf attachment completely. They are definitely dicots, though.
Oh, okay. Even though the plant itself is kind of like a fibrosis and
It
doesn't
has
have
some. There are
ring.
some fibers within it, but even dicots can have some of that, particularly on the young parts. But I'm pretty, as I recall, looking at papayas, I'm pretty sure it's a dicot off the top of my head without seeing one in front of me.
Okay, yeah, the plant itself to me, you know, the stem, it looks like dicot, and the monocots, and then the leaves they don't. It's kind of
Right.
weird.
And so sometimes you can't look at just one thing. You have to kind of look at a combination. There seem to be some exceptions. Some things look like this has a pretty small roots. I think it's pretty fibrous, but it definitely has 4 petal leaves on it. You know, that's going to tell me it's probably a dicot, you know, and even though the roots are pretty small, you know, or the leaf looks like it's kind of elongated around, but is that, you know, then you start looking at the veins in it. Do the veins crisscross, or are they really from one spot moving out and across? So does that help? There's always exceptions. That's the one thing I learned in biology class very early. There will always be exceptions. It's a living thing. Other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Questions going once? Your brain probably feels a little bit like mush, and that's okay. That means I've probably done my job. I got half of a semester of college botany down into your skull in 2 hours. That's a lot of process. You've got to take some time to go back and relook at it, and not just between now and Monday, but over the next 8, 12 weeks while you're going through this class. You're going to get pieces of it each time. So don't feel like it's just more than I can think. I'll tell you this, there's a lot of technical information in this, but don't let it get you down. It's the starting point. I want you to be familiar. Say, I remember he talked about dormancy, or he talked about petioles, when I get to leaves, or what's a node versus, oh, I remember hearing about a node. Let me look at that, or a tuber or a rhizome. Oh yeah, I remember that term rhizome. Let me go back and look in my book, but I didn't want you to just not have a clue of what we're talking about. And that's why we do this as a quick overview. Okay. Last chance. Questions going once. Questions going twice.
One more.
One more. Okay.
Okay, the bananas. Bananas are trees. They are palms. What are they? I'm getting
They are
two.
definitely monocots. They are like giant grass plants.
Yes.
You look at the interior of them. They have a lot of, but they have a lot more water in their leaves that are wrapped around. The center of a banana is way down deep, and the stem is. So when you cut them off and you see something, it's a new leaf popping up out of the middle when you cut them off. So all of that, what we think of as the banana trunk, that's really the outside of the banana leaves that are sheets that are wrapped around, that are full of water, and that's what you're seeing. So that's why when they die back and we cut them to the bottom, they pop up from the bottom. That's because that stem, that growing point, the tip of the stem is really way down deep, almost at the soil level.
Yes, I see them. They look like onions.
Yes, just like onions. Yeah, they're kind of like onions. Only the leaves are a lot longer and they wrap around, and their bananas are interesting. Again, they're all adaptations. All these things are adaptations by plants so that they can survive in whatever environment they're in.
Thank you. I want to learn more about them because I want to get some.
Okay. They're a good, easy tropical plant. There are some that are production oriented that you can get more edible, more flavorful, or larger bananas on, and some of them are more ornamental. So you look at that, and there's I don't know who's doing fruits and vegetables for you, but there are several varieties you can ask when you go to the nurseries. You can ask them and say, I want something that will actually produce edible bananas. You're not going to get the one that you get in the HEB, I'll tell you right now, because the Cavendish is not
Yes.
commercially available.
No, I'm
Not for us, but there are some others out there. One of the ones I know that people have had success with locally that's a little bit smaller is called ice cream. That's the variety of banana. So, but Turner's has more in that tropical fruit type stuff. You can ask Stan over there, is very knowledgeable in fruits and tropical fruits.
Yeah, I noticed the one that gets here, the Saba. It's kind of like plantain, but it's a shorter, fatty one.
So
Yes.
again, look at the different ones, and there's lots of varieties. And the nice thing is now with the internet, you can buy different things, and as long as they're permitted, you can have them shipped. So you can, we really have a global plant economy compared to what we even had 20 years ago, which you can get a lot more things than you used to be able to get. But with
Kevin,
that means you have to make wise choices. And because people just get stuff and don't think about it and what they do, that's how we have so many invasive plants around. Those plants that are super adapted, and there's nothing to keep them in check. There's no other animals or other types of plants that would prevent them from overproducing. And that's how we get weeds that take over the world. And that's, kudzu, for instance, was brought in as a really cool plant from Japan, but it was in a northern climate and it would die back every year. You brought it to America during the World's Fair in Philadelphia, and someone took a cutting of it and took it down south, and guess what? It was never cold enough to completely kill it, and kudzu started taking over the world. So we have to make choices. Be careful.
Kevin will be teaching the tropical plant class.
Good. He gets to answer all those fun questions about papayas and bananas and all that. So tell him in advance, warn him, say, I want to know a lot about papayas and bananas. So he'll cover part of that for you. If not, he'll give you some one-on-one time.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Womack.
Thank you. I'll see y'all on Monday night then.
Thank you.
Or you won't see me. I won't see you, but I will talk to you on Monday night. Have a good weekend, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.